Well, welcome to the third annual Science Diplomacy Conference here at AAAS. It's actually the fourth Science Diplomacy Conference we've had. In 2008, when the AAAS Center for Science Diplomacy was launched, we also held actually a two-day conference here, primarily focused on U.S. science diplomacy then. So it's been almost 10 years, but as you know, you're here, you recognize that science diplomacy has only grown in terms of interest and importance since then. So thank you all for coming. And also in particular, like to thank all the organizers, session moderators, speakers, many volunteers who have contributed to this conference. It's one of the elements of the conference in which this is really about building the community of science diplomacy stakeholders, that we try to get as many involved in this conference as possible, in its preparation, in the, all the great talks that you'll hear, and the discussions we'll have over the course of the next 12 hours or so. I'd also like to thank and our longtime supporters of this center, including conferences like this, from the Golden family as well as the Lounsbury Foundation for their really they had a lot of foresight in supporting this issue of science diplomacy at AAAS and in different organizations around the country and indeed around the world. We have a terrific program today. We're going to start off with one of the biggest, most major international science diplomacy issues, and that is Sustainable Development Goals. And we'll wind our way through today with really a diverse set of topics that you could see the breadth of science diplomacy and what it is in today's world, today's diplomacy and science. And finally, at least to end our formal program, we'll have a plenary lecture from Dr. Carl June. And this is really a matter of where cutting-edge science meets diplomacy. And he comes from the immunotherapy world, so I hope you'll stick around for that, because that should be quite exciting. But that's not it. We have a great informal end to this day with a networking reception starting at 6. And we'll have great posters from students and universities around the U.S., but actually around the world as you enjoy the reception. And we also have a special small part of an exhibit from the American Museum of Natural History. So I'd like to thank our partners there with a series of videos from their special exhibit called Cuba that's currently playing at the museum in New York. So they were kind enough to bring it down here for all of our enrichment and enjoyment. So one final thing, and it's actually probably the most important, is that we really value your feedback on how this conference will go for you today. And so I think when you checked in and registered, you received feedback forms. Please turn them in to the boxes you'll see around the second floor, as well as the first floor near the registration table when you leave at 8 p.m. tonight. It's really been useful over the last few years for us to, as you've come to previous editions of this conference, shape and continue to evolve this conference in a way that really benefits all you participants, everybody here, so that it's as useful as possible. So thank you for that. So without further ado, I'd like to ask the CEO of AAAS and executive publisher of the Science family of journals, Rush Holt, to give a welcome.
Thank you, Tom. And welcome to all of you. You look great. It is a terrific assembly. You will find that one of the greatest benefits of today will be interacting with the others here. It is a wonderful mix. You are a very distinguished and able group of people, and I hope you all get time to find the time to interact with each other. I'm Rush Holt. I'm the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and executive publisher of our journals, including Science Magazine. And I am pleased to welcome you here. We're the world's largest general science membership organization with programs in science and society, science and public policy, science education, science and the law, science and religion, science and public affairs. We place more than 250 PhD-level scientists every year as science and technology policy fellows in all three branches of the U.S. federal government. And we work with science advisors, science ministers, science organizations, and scientists in many countries around the world. And I'm really delighted to see this turnout, which is a recognition of one of our important programs, which is science and diplomacy. I like to think that we have elevated the very idea of science and diplomacy into international recognition. Last year's conference, some of you attended, took place in a, well, at least from the US perspective, a different world. But the issues that I mentioned to you then, border-spanning infectious diseases, emerging technologies like gene editing and artificial intelligence that present challenges to society, persistent threats to national security, they may sound familiar. They are still, even though some of the politics has changed, the issues remain the same. In the US political environment, with government proposals to cut funding, really dramatically in some cases, in science and technology and related activities and diplomacy, and to emphasize hard power over soft power, it's good to remember what an important 1999 report of the National Academies said. This was the report on the, it was called The Pervasive Role of Science, Technology, and Health in Foreign Policy. And the report cited examples of issues with significant science and technology content and foreign policy relevance. Brain drain, missile and nuclear technologies, earthquake engineering, water security, issues still very relevant today, even in a changing political world. That is one of the things that science brings to international affairs, is a longer-term perspective. And it's always a challenge to get the diplomats and politicians to adopt a longer-term perspective, but it's something we can bring that is valuable. It was true in 1999, as it is now, that the US State Department benefits tremendously from the outcomes of scientific research and from input from scientists and engineers. The Department of State, the US Department of State, is really in a good position compared to other federal agencies to provide a forum to identify and define key issues that cross national borders. US science, technology, and innovation are among the most significant sources of American soft power through programs such as our fellowship program here at AAAS and others, the State Department's Jefferson Fellowships, for example. The Department of State is has more and more diplomats with scientific credibility and scientific contacts across the engineering and scientific communities. And the recognition of the importance of science and technology to diplomacy and vice versa continues to grow internationally. At this conference, out of more than 40 participants, speakers I mean, more than a quarter are from outside the United States. At the annual meeting of AAAS in Boston just a month ago, we had large international participation, both in the seminars and in visiting dignitaries. We were pleased to recognize Minister Pandor of South Africa with the AAAS Science Diplomacy Award. And we continue in those activities every way we can. It bears reminding that science diplomacy is not just about government action. Some governments may be pulling inward these days. That makes it even more important for non-governmental scientists, scientific organizations, NGOs, to push forward with international engagement. It depends on, in many cases, scientists, technologists, really stepping into the public square, stepping into the international arena, sometimes reluctantly. And so we need to find ways to encourage that those scientists and engineers to help engage in international relations and in science and diplomacy. The science and technology people need to understand that they can improve and enhance international relations, not just advancing their international research projects, but actually improving and advancing relations. The principles that scientists live by and uphold, freedoms of travel, collaboration, and communication, openness, transparency, free flow of ideas, diverse members of research teams, those principles have always benefited the scientific enterprise here in the United States. They've attracted international talent, and other nations have also benefited. Scientists can extend these principles across boundaries and have far-reaching, sometimes unexpected benefits. We in the United States, and I think many around the world, friends of science, are discovering that we've been maybe a little casual in defending these principles, that science needs to thrive, and that science can bring then to international affairs. We see with immigration restrictions and restrictions on travel, restrictions on communication, that are considered with little regard for their effect on the practice of science, do indeed have an effect, a negative effect, on the practice of science. And in defending these principles, scientists and friends of science can not only advance the scientific process, the scientific enterprise, but also make these principles available for international benefit. We know that fostering safe and responsible conduct of research is essential for scientific advancement and for national prosperity and international security. So we have to encourage the best and brightest international students, scholars, scientists, to not only move around the world for their science, but also to recognize what they can bring to international relations. The progress of science knows no borders, and scientific goals represent shared values. So that makes it possible to build bridges that well, are hard to build in many cases otherwise. And the non-governmental parts of the scientific community are particularly important in these areas. So We will hear next from Bill Colglazer, who is co-chair of the UN's Technology Facilitation Mechanism, and he is a senior scholar here at AAAS at the Center for Science Diplomacy and editor of our journal, Science Diplomacy. He's got a terrific panel, which I will let him introduce on, to discuss sustainable development goals. I think we've got a long way to go, not only in achieving those goals, but in even bringing recognition to their existence. I would say in the policy world, in the policy circles here in the United States, the SDGs are little known. Oh yes, some of you in the State Department probably hear about them, and in a few NGOs. But I think we have a lot of work to do to advance the SDGs in the public recognition, even as we work to advance them in the lives of the people of the world. The goals can be reached only with contributions to and progress in science and technology, and we have to repeat that over and over again. Making progress will require a consensus in society on what actions and roadmaps are needed in each country and what are needed across national boundaries. So there's a lot of work to do. These make, I think, really valuable organizing principles. Principles that we can organize around. Goals that will advance welfare of people, but it will also advance government function and will advance, I would argue, science and technology in the process. So it goes both ways. And addressing global issues like the SDGs really require bottom-up energy and ingenuity. The kind of energy and ingenuity that I see in this room. So I thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to AAAS.